Your admirers can be friends, or even suitors. Call it the harem effect. Pauline Bonaparte, sister of Napoleon, raised her value in men's eyes by always having a group of worshipful men around her at balls and parties. If she went for a walk, it was never with one man, always with 2 or 3. Perhaps these men were simply friends, or even just props and hangers-on. The sight of them was enough to suggest that she was prized and desired, a woman worth fighting over. Andy Warhol, too, surrounded himself with the most glamorous, interesting people he could find. To be part of his inner circle meant that you were desirable as well. By placing himself in the middle but keeping himself aloof from it all, he made everyone compete for his attention. He stirred people's desire to possess him by holding back. Practices like these not only stimulate competitive desires, they take aim at people's prime weakness, their vanity and self-esteem. We can endure feeling that another person has more talent or more money, but the sense that a rival is more desirable than we are, that is unbearable. In the early 18th century, the Duc de Richelieu, a great rake, managed to seduce a young woman who was rather religious, but whose husband, a dolt, was often away. He then proceeded to seduce her upstairs neighbor, a young widow. When the 2 women discovered that he was going from one to the other in the same night, they confronted him. A lesser man would have fled, but not the Duke. He understood the dynamic of vanity and desire. Neither woman wanted to feel that he preferred the other. And so, he managed to arrange a little ménage à trois, knowing that now they would struggle between themselves to be the favorite. When people's vanity is at risk, you can make them do whatever you want. If there is a woman you're interested in, pay attention to her sister. That will stir a triangular desire. Your reputation, your illustrious past as a seducer, is an effective way of creating an aura of desirability. Women threw themselves at Errol Flynn's feet, not because of his handsome face and certainly not because of his acting skills, but because of his reputation. They knew that other women had found him irresistible. Once he had established that reputation, he did not have to chase women anymore. They came to him. Men who believe that a rakish reputation will make women fear or distrust them and should be played down are quite wrong. On the contrary, it makes them more attractive. The virtuous Duchess de Montpensier, the grande mademoiselle of 17th century France, began by enjoying a friendship with the rake Lausanne. But a troubling thought soon occurred to her. If a man with Lausanne's past did not see her as a possible lover, something had to be wrong with her. This anxiety eventually pushed her into his arms. To be part of a great seducer's club of conquests can be a matter of vanity and pride. We are happy to be in such company, to have our name broadcast as this man or this woman's lover. Your own reputation may not be so alluring, but you must find a way to suggest to your victim that others, many others, have found you desirable. It is reassuring. There is nothing like a restaurant full of empty tables to persuade you not to go in. A variation on the triangle strategy is the use of contrasts. Careful exploitation of people who are dull or unattractive may enhance your desirability by comparison. At a social affair, for instance, make sure your target has to chat with the most boring person available. Come to the rescue and your target will be delighted to see you. To make use of contrasts, either develop and display those attractive attributes, humor, vivacity, and so on, that are the scarcest in your own social group, or choose a group in which your natural qualities are rare and will shine. The use of contrasts has vast political ramifications, for a political figure must also seduce and seem desirable. Learn to play up the qualities that your rivals lack. Peter II, Tsar in 18th century Russia, was arrogant and irresponsible, so his wife, Catherine the Great, did all she could do to seem modest and dependable. When Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia in 1917 after Tsar Nicholas II had been deposed, he made a show of decisiveness and discipline, precisely what no other leader had at the time. In the American presidential race of 1980, the irresoluteness of Jimmy Carter made the single-mindedness of Ronald Reagan look desirable. Contrasts are eminently seductive because they do not depend on your own words or self-advertisements. The public reads them unconsciously and sees what it wants to see. Finally, appearing to be desired by others will raise your value, but often how you carry yourself can influence this as well. Don't let your targets see you so often. Keep your distance, seem unattainable, out of their reach. An object that is rare and hard to obtain is generally more prized. 5. Create a need, stir anxiety and discontent. A perfectly satisfied person cannot be seduced. Tension and disharmony must be instilled in your target's minds. Stir within them feelings of discontent and unhappiness with their circumstances and with themselves. Their life lacks adventure. They have strayed from the ideals of their youth. They have become boring. The feelings of inadequacy that you create will give you space to insinuate yourself, to make them see you as the answer to their problems. Pain and anxiety are the proper precursors to pleasure. Learn to manufacture the need that you can fill. Everyone wears a mask in society. We pretend to be more sure of ourselves than we are. We don't want other people to glimpse that doubting self within us. In truth, our egos and personalities are much more fragile than they appear to be. They cover up feelings of confusion and emptiness. As a seducer, you must never mistake a person's appearance for the reality. People are always susceptible to being seduced because, in fact, everyone lacks a sense of completeness, feels something missing deep inside. Bring their doubts and anxieties to the surface, and they can be led and lured to follow you. No one can see you as someone to follow or fall in love with unless they first reflect on themselves somehow and on what they are missing. Before the seduction proceeds, you must place a mirror in front of them in which they glimpse that inner emptiness. Made aware of a lack, they now can focus on you as the person who can fill that empty space. Remember, most of us are lazy. To relieve our feelings of boredom or inadequacy on our own takes too much effort. Letting someone else do the job is both easier and more exciting. The desire to have someone fill up our emptiness is the weakness on which all seducers prey. Make people anxious about the future, make them depressed, make them question their identity, make them sense the boredom that gnaws at their life. The ground is prepared. The seeds of seduction can be sown. Cleopatra got Julius Caesar to sleep with her the first night he met her, but the real seduction, the one that made him her slave, began later. In their ensuing conversations, she talked repeatedly of Alexander the Great, the hero from whom she supposedly descended. No one could compare to him. By implication, Caesar was made to feel inferior. Understanding that beneath his bravado, Caesar was insecure, Cleopatra awakened in him an anxiety, a hunger to prove his greatness. Once he felt this way, he was easily further seduced. Doubts about his masculinity was his tender spot. When Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra turned her sights on Mark Antony, one of Caesar's successors in the leadership of Rome. Antony loved pleasure and spectacle, and his tastes were crude. She appeared to him first on her royal barge, then wined and dined and banqueted him. Everything was geared to suggest to him the superiority of the Egyptian way of life over the Roman, at least when it came to pleasure. The Romans were boring and unsophisticated by comparison. And once Antony was made to feel how much he was missing in spending his time with his dull soldiers and his matronly Roman wife, he could be made to see Cleopatra as the incarnation of all that was exciting. He became her slave. This is the lure of the exotic. In your role of seducer, try to position yourself as coming from outside, as a stranger of sorts. You represent change, difference, a breakup of routines. Make your victims feel that by comparison, their lives are boring and their friends less interesting than they had thought. There are many legends of Don Juan, but they often describe him seducing a village girl by making her feel her life is horribly provincial. He, meanwhile, wears glittering clothes and has a noble bearing. Strange and exotic, he's always from somewhere else. First, she feels the boredom of her life. Then, she sees him as her salvation. Remember, people prefer to feel that if their life is uninteresting, it's not because of themselves, but because of their circumstances, the dull people they know, the town into which they were born. Once you make them feel the lure of the exotic, Another devilishly seductive area to aim at is the victim's past. To grow old is to renounce or compromise youthful ideals, to become less spontaneous, less alive in a way. This knowledge lies dormant in all of us. As a seducer, you must bring it to the surface, make it clear how far people have strayed from their past goals and ideals. You, in turn, present yourself as representing that ideal, as offering a chance to recapture lost youth through adventure, through seduction. Old age is constantly seduced by youth, but first, the young people must make it clear what the older ones are missing, how they have lost their ideals. Only then will they feel that the presence of the young will let them recapture that spark, the rebellious spirit that age and society have conspired to repress. This concept has infinite applications. Corporations and politicians know that they cannot seduce their public into buying what they want them to buy or doing what they want them to do unless they first awaken a sense of need and discontent. Make the masses uncertain about their identity, and you can help define it for them. It is as true of groups or nations as it is of individuals. They can't be seduced without being made to feel some lack. A group, like an individual, can get mired in routine, losing track of its original goals. Too much prosperity saps it of strength. You can seduce an entire nation by aiming at its collective insecurity, that latent sense that not everything is what it seems. Stirring dissatisfaction with the present and reminding people about the glorious past can unsettle their sense of identity. Then you can be the one to redefine it. A grand seduction. 6. Master the art of insinuation. You can't pass through life without in one way or another trying to persuade people of something. Take the direct route, saying exactly what you want, and your honesty may make you feel good, but you are probably not getting anywhere. People have their own sets of ideas which are hardened into stone by habit. Your words entering their minds compete with the thousands of preconceived notions that are already there and get nowhere. Besides, people resent your attempt to persuade them as if they were incapable of deciding by themselves, as if you knew better. Consider instead the power of insinuation and suggestion. It requires some patience and art, but the results are more than worth it. The way insinuation works is simple. Disguised in a banal remark or encounter, a hint is dropped. It is about some emotional issue, a possible pleasure not yet attained, a lack of excitement in a person's life. The hint registers in the back of the target's mind, a subtle stab at his or her insecurities. Its source is quickly forgotten. It is too subtle to be memorable at the time, and later, when it takes root and grows, it seems to have emerged naturally from the target's own mind, as if it was there all along. Insinuation lets you bypass people's natural resistance, for they seem to be listening only to what has originated in themselves. It is a language on its own, communicating directly with the unconscious. No seducer, no persuader can hope to succeed without mastering the language and art of insinuation. Slips of the tongue, apparently inadvertent sleep-on-it comments, alluring references, statements for which you quickly apologize, all of these have immense insinuating power. They get under people's skin and take on a life of their own. The key to succeeding with your insinuations is to make them when your targets are at their most relaxed or distracted, so that they are not aware of what is happening. Polite banter is often the perfect front for this. People are thinking about what they will say next or are absorbed in their own thoughts. Your insinuations will barely register, which is how you want it. In one of his early campaigns, John F. Kennedy addressed a group of veterans. Kennedy's brave exploits during World War II, the PT-109 incident that made him a war hero, were known to all. But in the speech, he talked of the other men on the boat, never mentioning himself. He knew, however, that what he had done was on everyone's mind, because in fact, he had put it there. Not only did his silence on the subject make them think of it on their own, it made Kennedy seem humble and modest, qualities that go well with heroism. In Seduction, as the French courtesan Ninon de L'Enclos advised, it is better not to talk about your love for a person. Let your target read it in your manner. Your silence on the subject will have more insinuating power than if you had addressed it directly. Not only words insinuate, pay attention to gestures and looks. The face speaks its own language. We are used to trying to read people's faces, which are often better indicators of their feelings than what they say, which is so easy to control. Since people are always reading your looks, use them to transmit the insinuating. Finally, the reason insinuation works so well is not just that it bypasses people's natural resistance. It is also the language of pleasure. There is too little mystery in the world. Too many people say exactly what they feel or want. We yearn for something enigmatic, for something to feed our fantasies. Because of the lack of suggestion and ambiguity in daily life, the person who uses them suddenly seems to have something alluring and full of promise. It's a kind of titillating game. What is this person up to? What does he mean? Or she mean? Hints, suggestions, and insinuations create a seductive atmosphere, signaling that their victim is no longer involved in the routines of daily life, but has entered into another realm. 7. Enter their spirit. One of the great sources of frustration in our lives is other people's stubbornness. How hard it is to reach them, to make them see things our way. We often have the impression that when they seem to be listening to us and apparently agreeing with us, it is all superficial. The moment we are gone, they revert to their own ideas. We spend our lives butting up against people as if they were stone walls. But instead of complaining about how misunderstood or ignored you are, why not try something different? Instead of seeing other people as spiteful or indifferent, instead of trying to figure out why they act the way they do, look at them through the eyes of the seducer. The way to lure people out of their natural intractability and self-obsession is to enter their spirit. All of us are narcissists. When we were children, our narcissism was physical. We were interested in our own image, our own body, as if it were a separate being. As we grow older, our narcissism grows more psychological. We become absorbed in our own tastes, opinions, experiences. A hard shell forms around us. Paradoxically, The way to entice people out of this shell is to become more like them. In fact, a kind of mirror image of them. You do not have to spend days studying their minds. Simply conform to their moods, adapt to their tastes, play along with whatever they send your way. In doing so, you will lower their natural defensiveness. Their sense of self-esteem does not feel threatened by your strangeness or different habits. People truly love themselves, but what they love most of all is to see their ideas and tastes reflected in another person. This validates them. Their habitual insecurity vanishes. Hypnotized by their mirror image, they relax. Now that their inner wall has crumbled, you can slowly draw them out and eventually turn the dynamic around. Once they are open to you, it becomes easy to infect them with your own moods and heat. Entering the other person's spirit is a kind of hypnosis. It is the most insidious and effective form of persuasion known to man. 8. Create temptation. Most of the time, people struggle to maintain security and a sense of balance in their lives. If they were always uprooting themselves in pursuit of every new person or fantasy that passed them by, they could not survive the daily grind. They usually win the struggle, but it doesn't come easy. The world is full of temptation. They read about people who have more than they do, about adventures others are having, about people who have found wealth and happiness. The security that they strive for and that they seem to have in their lives is actually an illusion. It covers up a constant tension. As a seducer, you can never mistake people's appearance for reality. You know that their fight to keep order in their lives is exhausting, and that they are gnawed by doubts and regrets. It is hard to be good and virtuous, always having to repress the strongest desires. With that knowledge in mind, seduction is easier. What people want is not temptation. Temptation happens every day. What people want is to give in to temptation, to yield. That is the only way to get rid of the tension in their lives. It costs much more to resist temptation than to surrender. Your task then is to create a temptation that is stronger than the daily variety. It has to be focused on them, aimed at them as individuals. Understand, everyone has a principal weakness from which others stem. Find that childhood insecurity, that lack in their life, and you hold the key to tempting them. Their weakness may be greed, vanity, boredom, some deeply repressed desire, a hunger for forbidden fruit. They signal it in little details that elude their conscious control. Their style of clothing, an offhand comment. Their past, and particularly their past romances, will be littered with clues. Give them a potent temptation tailored to their weakness, and you can make the hope of pleasure that you stir in them figure more prominently than the doubts and anxieties that accompany it. Many such social barriers are gone today, so they have to be manufactured. It is the only way to put spice into seduction. Taboos of any kind are a source of tension, and they are psychological now, not religious. You are looking for some repression, some secret desire that will make your victims squirm uncomfortably if you hit upon it, but will tempt them all the more. Search in their past. Whatever they seem to fear or flee from might hold the key. It could be a yearning for a mother or father figure, or a latent homosexual desire. Perhaps you can satisfy that desire by presenting yourself as a masculine woman or a feminine man. For others, you play the Lolita or the daddy, someone they're not supposed to have, the dark side of their personality. Keep the connection vague. You want them to reach for something elusive, something that comes out of their own mind. Phase 2. Lead astray, creating pleasure and confusion. Your victims are sufficiently intrigued and their desire for you is growing, but their attachment is weak, and at any moment, they could decide to turn back. The goal in this phase is to lead your victims so far astray, keeping them emotional and confused, giving them pleasure but making them want more, that retreat is no longer possible. Springing on them a pleasant surprise will make them see you as delightfully unpredictable, but will also keep them off balance. The artful use of soft and pleasant words will intoxicate them and stimulate fantasies. Aesthetic touches and pleasant little rituals will titillate their senses, distract their minds. Your greatest danger in this phase is the mere hint of routine or familiarity. You need to maintain some mystery, to keep a little distance so that in your absence, your victims become obsessed with you. They may realize that they are falling for you, but they must never suspect how much of this has come from your manipulations. A well-timed display of your weakness, of how emotional you have become under their influence, will help cover your tracks. To excite your victims and make them highly emotional, you must give them the feeling that they are actually living some of the fantasies you have stirred in their imagination. By giving them only a part of the fantasy, you will keep them coming back for more. Focusing your attention on them so that the rest of the world fades away, even taking them on a trip, will lead them far astray. There is no turning back. 9. Keep them in suspense. What comes next? The moment people feel they know what to expect from you, your spell on them is broken. More, you have ceded them power. The only way to lead the seduced along and keep the upper hand is to create suspense, a calculated surprise. People love a mystery, and this is the key to luring them further into your web. Behave in a way that leaves them wondering, what are you up to? Doing something they don't expect from you will give them a delightful sense of spontaneity. They will not be able to foresee what comes next. You are always one step ahead and in control. Give the victim a thrill with a sudden change of direction. A child is usually a willful, stubborn creature who will deliberately do the opposite of what we ask. But there is one scenario in which children will happily give up their usual willfulness when they are promised a surprise. Perhaps it is a present hidden in a box, a game with an unforeseeable ending, a journey with an unknown destination, a suspenseful story with a surprise finish. In those moments when children are waiting for a surprise, their willpower is suspended. They are in your thrall for as long as you dangle possibility before them. This childish habit is buried deep within us and is the source of an elemental human pleasure. Being led by a person who knows where they are going and who takes us. We get a similar thrill when we watch a movie or read a thriller. We are in the hands of a director or author who is leading us along, taking us through twists and turns. We stay in our seats, we turn the pages, happily enslaved by the suspense. It is the pleasure a woman has in being led by a confident dancer, letting go of any defensiveness she may feel and letting another person do the work. Falling in love involves anticipation. We are about to head off in a new direction, enter a new life where everything will be strange. The seduced wants to be led, to be carried along like a child. If you are predictable, the charm wears off. Everyday life is predictable. Not only does suddenness create a seductive jolt, it conceals manipulations. Appear somewhere unexpectedly, say or do something sudden, and people will not have time to figure out that your move was calculated. Take them to some new place as if it only just occurred to you, suddenly reveals some secret. Made emotionally vulnerable, they will be too bewildered to see through you. Anything that happens suddenly seems natural, and anything that seems natural has a seductive charm. Finally, you might think it wiser to present yourself as someone reliable, not given to caprice. If so, you are in fact merely timid. It takes courage and effort to mount a seduction. Reliability is fine for drawing people in, but stay reliable and you stay a bore. Dogs are reliable. A seducer is not. If, on the other hand, you prefer to improvise, imagining that any kind of planning or calculation is antithetical to the spirit of surprise, you are making a grave mistake. Constant improvisation simply means you are lazy and thinking only about yourself. What often seduces a person is the feeling that you have expended effort on their behalf. You don't need to trumpet this too loudly, but make it clear in the gifts you make, the little journeys you plan, the little teases you lure people with. Little efforts like these will be more than amply rewarded by the conquest of the heart and willpower of the seduced. 10. Use the demonic power of words to sow confusion. We rarely think before we talk. It is human nature to say the first thing that comes into our head, and usually what comes first is something about ourselves. We primarily use words to express our own feelings, ideas, and opinions, also to complain and to argue. This is because we are generally self-absorbed. The person who interests us most is our own self. To a certain extent, this is inevitable, and through much of our lives there is nothing much wrong with it. We can function quite well this way. In seduction, however, it limits our potential. You can't seduce without an ability to get outside your own skin and inside another person's, piercing their psychology. The key to seductive language is not the words you utter or your seductive tone of voice. It is a radical shift in perspective and habit. You have to stop saying the first thing that comes to your mind. You have to control the urge to prattle and vent your opinions. The key is to see words as a tool not for communicating true thoughts and feelings, but for confusing, delighting, and intoxicating. The difference between normal language and seductive language is like the difference between noise and music. Noise is a constant in modern life, something irritating we tune out if we can. Our normal language is like noise. People may half listen to us as we go on about ourselves, but just as often their thoughts are a million miles away. Every now and then their ears prick up when something we say touches on them. But this lasts only until we return to yet another story about ourselves. As early as childhood, we learn to tune out this kind of noise, particularly when it comes from our parents. Music, on the other hand, is seductive and gets under our skin. It is intended for pleasure. A melody or a rhythm stays in our blood for days after we have heard it, altering our moods and emotions, relaxing or exciting us. To make music instead of noise, you must say things that please, things that relate to people's lives, that touch their vanity. If they have many problems, you can produce the same effect by distracting them, focusing their attention away from themselves by saying things that are witty and entertaining, or that make the future seem bright and hopeful. Promises and flattery are music to anyone's ears. This is language designed to move people and lower their resistance. It is language designed for them, not to. Flattery is seductive language in its purest form. Its purpose is not to express a truth or a real feeling, but only to create an effect on the recipient. Learn to aim your flattery directly at a person's insecurities. For instance, if a man is a fine actor and feels confident about his professional skills, to flatter him about his acting will have little effect and may even accomplish the opposite. He could feel that he is above the need to have his ego stroked, and your flattery will seem to say otherwise. But let us say that this actor is an amateur musician or painter. He does this work on his own without professional support or publicity, and he is well aware that others make their living at it. Flattery of his artistic pretensions will go straight to his head and earn you double points. Learn to sniff out the parts of a person's ego that need validation. Make it a surprise, something no one else has thought to flatter before, something you can describe as a talent or positive quality that others have not noticed. Speak with a little tremor, as if your target's charms had overwhelmed you and made you emotional. Flattery can be a kind of verbal foreplay. Aphrodite's powers of seduction, which were said to come from the magnificent girdle she wore, involved a sweetness of language, a skill with the soft, flattering words that prepare the way for erotic thoughts. Insecurities and nagging self-doubts have a dampening effect on the libido. Make your targets feel secure and alluring through your flattering words, and their resistance will melt away. Sometimes the most pleasant thing to hear is the promise of something wonderful, a vague but rosy future that is just around the corner. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his public speeches, talked little about specific programs for dealing with the Depression. Instead, he used rousing rhetoric to paint a picture of America's glorious future. In the various legends of Don Juan, the great seducer would immediately focus women's attention on the future, a fantastic world to which he promised to whisk them off. Tailor your sweet words to your target's particular problems and fantasies. Promise something realizable, something possible, but do not make it too specific. You are inviting them to dream. If they are mired in dull routine, talk of adventure, preferably with you. Don't discuss how it will be accomplished. Speak as if it magically already existed somewhere in the future. Lift people's thoughts into the clouds, and they will relax. Their defenses will come down, and it will be that much easier to maneuver and lead them astray. Your words become a kind of elevating drug. The most anti-seductive form of language is argument. How many silent enemies do we create by arguing? There is a superior way to get people to listen and be persuaded: humor and a light touch. The 19th century English politician Benjamin Disraeli was a master at this game. In Parliament, to fail to reply to an accusation or slanderous comment was a deadly mistake. Silence meant the accuser was right. Yet to respond angrily to get into an argument was to look ugly and defensive. Disraeli used a different tactic. He stayed calm. When the time came to reply to an attack, he would slowly make his way to the speaker's table, pause, and then utter a humorous or sarcastic retort. Everyone would laugh. Now that he had warmed people up, he would proceed to refute his enemy, still mixing in amusing comments, or perhaps he would simply move on to another subject, as if he were above it all. His humor took out the sting of any attack on him. Laughter and applause have a domino effect. Once your listeners have laughed, they are more likely to laugh again. In this lighthearted mood, they are also more apt to listen. A subtle touch and a bit of irony give you room to persuade them, move them to your side, mock your enemies. That is the seductive form. Perhaps you are not trying to whip a crowd into a frenzy. You just want to bring people over to your side. Choose your strategy and words carefully. You might think it is better to reason with people, explain your ideas, but it is hard for an audience to decide whether an argument is reasonable as they listen to you talk. They have to concentrate and listen closely, which requires great effort. People are easily distracted by other stimuli, and if they miss a part of your argument, they will feel confused, intellectually inferior, and vaguely insecure. It is more persuasive to appeal to people's hearts than their heads. Everyone shares emotions, and no one feels inferior to a speaker who stirs up their feelings. The crowd bonds together, everyone contagiously experiencing the same emotions. Use changes of perspective to make your listeners feel what you're saying. Orchestrate your effects. It is more effective to move from one emotion to another than to just hit one note. The emotions you're trying to arouse should be strong ones. Don't speak of friendship and disagreement. Speak of love and hate. And it is crucial to try to feel something of the emotions you're trying to elicit. You will be more believable that way. This shouldn't be difficult. Imagine the reasons for loving or hating before you speak. If necessary, think of something from your past that fills you with rage. Emotions are contagious. It is easier to make someone cry if you are crying yourself. Make your voice an instrument and train it to communicate emotion. Learn to seem sincere. Napoleon studied the greatest actors of his time, and when he was alone, he would practice putting emotion into his voice. The goal of seductive speech is often to create a kind of hypnosis. You are distracting people, lowering their defenses, making them more vulnerable to suggestion. Learn the hypnotist's lessons of repetition and affirmation, key elements in putting a subject to sleep. Repetition involves using the same words over and over, preferably a word with emotional content. Taxes, liberals, bigots. The effect is mesmerizing. Ideas can be permanently implanted in people's unconscious simply by being repeated often enough. Affirmation is simply the making of strong, positive statements like the hypnotist's commands. Seductive language should have a kind of boldness which will cover up a multitude of sins. Your audience will be so caught up in your bold language that they won't have time to reflect on whether or not it is true. Never say, "I don't think the other side made a wise decision." Say, "We deserve better," or "They have made a mess of things." Affirmative language is active language, full of verbs, imperatives, and short sentences. Cut out "I believe," "perhaps," "in my opinion." Head straight for the heart. You are learning to speak a different kind of language. Most people employ symbolic language. Their words stand for something real, the feelings, ideas, and beliefs they really have. Or they stand for concrete things in the real world. The origin of the word symbolic lies in a Greek word meaning to bring things together. In this case, a word and something real. As a seducer, you are using the opposite, diabolic language. Your words don't stand for anything real. Their sound and the feelings they evoke are more important than what they are supposed to stand for. The word diabolic ultimately means to separate, to throw things apart. Here, words and reality. The more you make people focus on your sweet-sounding language and on the illusions and fantasies it conjures, the more you diminish their contact with reality. You lead them into the clouds, where it is hard to distinguish truth from untruth, real from unreal. Keep your words vague and ambiguous so people are never quite sure what you mean. Envelop them in demonic, diabolical language, and they will not be able to focus on your maneuvers, on the possible consequences of your seduction. And the more they lose themselves in illusion, the easier it will be to lead them astray and seduce them. 11. Pay attention to detail. Lofty words and grand gestures can be suspicious. Why are you trying so hard to please? The details of a seduction, the subtle gestures, the offhand things you do, are often more charming and revealing. You must learn to distract your victims with a myriad of pleasant little rituals, thoughtful gifts tailored just for them, clothes and adornments designed to please them, gestures that show the time and attention you are paying them. All of their senses are engaged in the details you orchestrate. Create spectacles to dazzle their eyes. Mesmerized by what they see, they will not notice what you are really up to. Learn to suggest the proper feelings and moods through details. When we were children, our senses were much more active. The colors of a new toy or a spectacle such as a circus held us in thrall. A smell or a sound could fascinate us. In the games we created, many of them reproducing something in the adult world on a smaller scale, what pleasure we took in orchestrating every detail. We noticed everything. As we grow older, our senses get dulled. We no longer notice as much, for we are constantly hurrying to get things done to move on to the next task. In seduction, you are always trying to bring the target back to the golden moments of childhood. A child is less rational, more easily deceived. A child is also more attuned to the pleasures of the senses. So when your targets are with you, you must never give them the feeling that they normally get in the real world, where we are all rushed, ruthless, out for ourselves. You need to deliberately slow things down and return them to the simpler times of their youth. The details that you orchestrate, colors, gifts, little ceremonies, are aimed at their senses, at the childish delight we take in the immediate charms of the natural world. Their senses filled with delightful things, they grow less capable of reason and rationality. Pay attention to detail, and you will find yourself assuming a slower pace. Your targets will not focus on what you might be after, sexual favors, power, etc., because you seem so considerate, so attentive. In the childish realm of the senses in which you envelop them, they get a clear sense that you are involving them in something distinct from the real world, an essential ingredient of seduction. Remember, the more you get people to focus on the little things, the less they will notice your larger direction. The seduction will assume the slow, hypnotic pace of a ritual in which the details have a heightened importance and the moments are full of ceremony. Since time immemorial, women have known that within the most apparently self-possessed man is an animal whom they can lead by filling his senses with the proper physical lures. The key is to attack on as many fronts as possible. Don't ignore your voice, your gestures, your walk, your clothes, your glances. Some of the most alluring women in history have so distracted their victims with sensual detail that the men fail to notice it is all an illusion. From the 1940s on into the early 1960s, Pamela Churchill Harriman had a series of affairs with some of the most prominent and wealthy men in the world. Averil Harriman, whom years later she married. Gianni Agnelli, heir to the Fiat fortune. Baron Elie de Rothschild. What attracted these men and kept them in thrall was not her beauty or her lineage or her vivacious personality, but her extraordinary attention to detail. It began with her attentive look as she listened to your every word, soaking up your tastes. Once she found her way into your home, she would fill it with your favorite flowers, get your chef to cook that dish you had tasted only in the finest restaurants. You mentioned an artist you liked. A few days later, that artist would be attending one of your parties. She found the perfect antiques for you, dressed in the way that most pleased or excited you. And she did this without your saying a word. She spied, gathered information from third parties, overheard you talking to someone else. Harriman's attention to detail had an intoxicating effect on all the men in her life. It had something in common with the pampering of a mother, there to bring order and comfort into their lives, attending to their needs. Life is harsh and competitive. Attending to detail in a way that is soothing to the other person makes them dependent on you. The key is probing their needs in a way that is not too obvious, so that when you make precisely the right gesture, it seems uncanny, as if you had read their mind. This is another way of returning your targets to childhood when everything in seduction is a sign, nothing more so than clothes. It is not that you have to dress interestingly, elegantly, or provocatively, but that you have to dress for your target, have to appeal to your target's tastes. When Cleopatra was seducing Mark Antony, her dress was not brazenly sexual. She dressed as a Greek goddess, knowing his weakness for such fantasy figures. Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of King Louis XV, knew the king's weakness, his chronic boredom. She constantly wore different clothes, changing not only their color, but their style, supplying the king with a constant feast for his eyes. Pamela Harriman was subdued in the fashion she wore, befitting her role as a high society geisha and reflecting the sober tastes of the men she seduced. Contrast works well here. At work or at home, you might dress nonchalantly. Marilyn Monroe, for example, wore jeans and a t-shirt at home. But when you are with the target, you wear something elaborate, as if you were putting on a costume. Your Cinderella transformation will stir excitement and the feeling that you have done something just for the person you are with. Whenever your attention is individualized, you would not dress like that for anyone else. It is infinitely more seductive. In the 1870s, Queen Victoria found herself wooed by Benjamin Disraeli, her own prime minister. Disraeli's words were flattering and his manner insinuating. He also sent her flowers, valentines, gifts, but not just any flowers or gifts, the kind that most men would send. The flowers were primroses, symbols of their simple yet beautiful friendship. From then on, whenever Victoria saw a primrose, she thought of Disraeli. Or he would write on a valentine that he, no longer in the sunset but the twilight of his existence, must encounter a life of anxiety and toil. But this too has its romance when he remembers that he labors for the most gracious of beings. Or he might send her a little box with no inscription, but with a heart transfixed by an arrow on one side and the word fideliter, or faithfully, on the other. Victoria fell in love with Disraeli. A gift has immense seductive power, but the object itself is less important than the gesture and the subtle thought or emotion that it communicates. Perhaps the choice relates to something from the target's past, or symbolizes something between you, or merely represents the lengths you will go to please. It was not the money Disraeli spent that impressed Victoria, but the time he took to find the appropriate thing or make the appropriate gesture. Expensive gifts have no sentiment attached. They may temporarily excite their recipient, but they are quickly forgotten as a child forgets a new toy. The object that reflects its giver's attentiveness has a lingering, sentimental power, which resurfaces every time its owner sees it. Finally, words are important in seduction and have a great deal of power to confuse, distract, and boost the vanity of the target. But what is most seductive in the long run is what you do not say, what you communicate indirectly. Words come easily and people distrust them. Anyone can say the right words, and once they are said, nothing is binding, and they may even be forgotten altogether. The gesture, the thoughtful gift, the little details seem much more real and substantial. They are also much more charming than lofty words about love, precisely because they speak for themselves and let the seduced read into them more than is there. Never tell someone what you are feeling. Let them guess it in your looks and gestures. That is the more convincing language. 12. Poeticize your presence. We all have a self-image that is more flattering than the truth. We think of ourselves as more generous, selfless, honest, kindly, intelligent, or good-looking than in fact we are. It is extremely difficult for us to be honest with ourselves about our own limitations. We have a desperate need to idealize ourselves. As the writer Angela Carter remarks, we would rather align ourselves with angels than with the higher primates from which we are actually descended. This need to idealize extends to our romantic entanglements, because when we fall in love or under the spell of another person, we see a reflection of ourselves. The choice we make in deciding to become involved with another person reveals something important and intimate about us. We resist seeing ourselves as having fallen for someone who is cheap or tacky or tasteless because it reflects badly on who we are. Furthermore, we're often likely to fall for someone who resembles us in some way. Should that person be deficient, or worst of all, ordinary, then there is something deficient and ordinary about us. No, at all costs, the loved one must be overvalued and idealized, at least for the sake of our own self-esteem. Besides, in a world that is harsh and full of disappointment, it is a great pleasure to be able to fantasize about a person you are involved with. This makes the seducer's task easy. People are dying to be given the chance to fantasize about you. Don't spoil this golden opportunity by overexposing yourself or becoming so familiar and banal that the target sees you exactly as you are. You do not have to be an angel or a paragon of virtue. That would be quite boring. You can be dangerous, naughty, even somewhat vulgar, depending on the tastes of your victim. But never be ordinary or limited. In poetry, as opposed to reality, anything is possible. Soon after we fall under a person's spell, we form an image in our minds of who they are and what pleasures they might offer. Thinking of them when we are alone, we tend to make this image more and more idealized. Remember, if you're easily had, you can't be worth that much. It's hard to wax poetic about a person who comes so cheaply. If after the initial interest you make it clear that you can't be taken for granted, if you stir a bit of doubt, the target will imagine there is something special, lofty, and unattainable about you. Your image will crystallize in the other person's mind. Any kind of heightened experience, artistic or spiritual, lingers in the mind much longer than normal experience. You must find a way to share such moments with your targets, a concert, a play, a spiritual encounter, whatever it takes, so that they associate something elevated with you. Shared moments of exuberance have immense seductive pull. Also, any kind of object can be imbued with poetic resonance and sentimental associations, as discussed in the last section. The gifts you give and other objects can become imbued with your presence. If they are associated with pleasant memories, the sight of them keeps you in mind and accelerates the poeticization process. Although it is said that absence makes the heart grow fonder, an absence too early will prove deadly to the crystallization process. You must surround your targets with focused attention so that in those critical moments when they are alone, their mind is spinning with a kind of afterglow. Do everything you can to keep the target thinking about you. Letters, mementos, gifts, unexpected meetings, all of these give you an omnipresence. Everything must remind them of you. Finally, if your target should see you as elevated and poetic, there is much to be gained by making them feel elevated and poeticized in their turn. The French writer Chateaubriand would make a woman feel like a goddess. She had such a powerful effect on him. He would send her poems that she supposedly had inspired. To make Queen Victoria feel as if she were both a seductive woman and a great leader, Benjamin Disraeli would compare her to mythological figures and great predecessors such as Queen Elizabeth I. By idealizing your targets this way, you will make them idealize you in return, since you must be equally great to be able to appreciate and see all of their fine qualities. They will also grow addicted to the elevated feeling you give them. 13. Disarm through strategic weakness and vulnerability. Too much maneuvering on your part may raise suspicion. The best way to cover your tracks is to make the other person feel superior and stronger. If you seem to be weak, vulnerable, enthralled by the other person, and unable to control yourself, you will make your actions look more natural, less calculated. Physical weakness, tears, bashfulness, paleness will help create the effect. To further win trust, exchange honesty for virtue. Establish your sincerity by confessing some sin on your part. It doesn't have to be real. Sincerity is more important than goodness. Play the victim, then transform your target's sympathy into love. We all have weaknesses, vulnerabilities, frailnesses in our mental makeup. Perhaps we are shy or oversensitive or need attention. Whatever the weakness is, it is something we cannot control. We may try to compensate for it or to hide it, but this is often a mistake. People sense something inauthentic or unnatural. Remember, what is natural to your character is inherently seductive. A person's vulnerability, what they seem to be unable to control, is often what is most seductive about them. People who display no weaknesses, on the other hand, often elicit envy, fear, and anger. We want to sabotage them just to bring them down. Don't struggle against your vulnerabilities or try to repress them, but put them into play. Learn to transform them into power. The game is subtle. If you wallow in your weakness, overplay your hand, you will be seen as angling for sympathy or worse, as pathetic. No. What works best is to allow people an occasional glimpse into the soft, frail side of your character, and usually only after they have known you for a while. That glimpse will humanize you, lowering their suspicions and preparing the ground for a deeper attachment. Normally strong and in control, at moments you let go. Give in to your weakness. Let them see it. There are fears and insecurities peculiar to each sex. Your use of strategic weakness must always take these differences into account. A woman, for instance, may be attracted by a man's strength and self-confidence, but too much of it can create fear, seeming unnatural, even ugly. Particularly intimidating is the sense that the man is cold and unfeeling. She may feel insecure that he is only after sex and nothing else. Male seducers long ago learned to become more feminine, to show their emotions and to seem interested in their targets' lives. The medieval troubadours were the first to master this strategy. They wrote poetry in honor of women, emoted endlessly about their feelings, and spent hours in their ladies' boudoirs listening to the women's complaints and soaking up their spirit. In return for their willingness to play weak, the troubadours earned the right to love. Little has changed since then. Some of the greatest seducers in recent history understood the value of acting slavishly to a woman, like a troubadour on bended knee. The key is to indulge your softer side while still remaining as masculine as possible. This may include an occasional show of bashfulness, an extremely seductive tactic for a man. It gives the woman a sense of comfort and even of superiority. Remember, though, to keep everything in moderation. A glimpse of shyness is sufficient. Too much of it, and the target will despair, afraid that you will end up having to do all the work. A man's fears and insecurities often concern his sense of masculinity. He usually will feel threatened by a woman who is too overtly manipulative, who is too much in control. The greatest seductresses in history knew how to cover up their manipulations by playing the little girl in need of masculine protection. The women were the ones in control of the dynamic, boosting a man's sense of masculinity in order to ultimately enslave him. To make this most effective, a woman should seem both in need of protection and sexually excitable, giving the man his. The Empress Josephine, wife of Napoleon Bonaparte, won dominance over her husband early on through a calculated coquetry. Later on, though, she held on to that power through her constant and not so innocent use of tears. Seeing someone cry usually has an immediate effect on our emotions. We can't remain neutral. We feel sympathy and most often will do anything to stop the tears, including things that we normally wouldn't do. Weeping is an incredibly potent tactic, but the weeper is not always so innocent. There is usually something real behind the tears, but there may also be an element of acting, of playing for effect. And if the target senses this, the tactic is doomed. Beyond the emotional impact of tears, there is something seductive about sadness. We want to comfort the other person, as Tourvel discovered that desire quickly turns into love. Affecting sadness, even crying sometimes, has great strategic value even for a man. It is a skill you can learn. Use tears sparingly and save them for the right moment. Perhaps this might be a time when the target seems suspicious of your motives or when you are worrying about having no effect on him or her. Tears are a sure barometer of how deeply the other person is falling for you. If they seem annoyed or resist the bait, your case is probably hopeless. In social and political situations, seeming too ambitious or too controlled will make people fear you. It is crucial to show your soft side. The display of a single weakness will hide a multitude of manipulations. Emotion or even tears will work here too. Most seductive of all is playing the victim. For his first speech in Parliament, Benjamin Disraeli prepared an elaborate oration. But when he delivered it, the opposition yelled and laughed so loudly that hardly any of it could be heard. He plowed ahead and gave the whole speech, and by the time he sat down, he felt he had failed miserably. Much to his amazement, his colleagues told him the speech was a marvelous success. It would have been a failure if he had complained or given up, but by going ahead as he did, he positioned himself as the victim of a cruel and unreasonable faction. Almost everyone sympathized with him now, which would serve him well in the future. Attacking your mean-spirited opponents can make you seem ugly as well. Instead, soak up their blows and play the victim. The public will rally to your side in an emotional response that will lay the groundwork for a grand political seduction. 14. Confuse desire and reality, the perfect illusion. The real world can be unforgiving. Events occur over which we have little control. Other people ignore our feelings in their quests to get what they need. Time runs out before we accomplish what we had wanted. If we ever stopped to look at the present and future in a completely objective way, we would despair. Fortunately, we develop the habit of dreaming early on. In this other mental world that we inhabit, the future is full of rosy possibilities. Perhaps tomorrow we will sell that brilliant idea or meet the person who will change our lives. Our culture stimulates these fantasies with constant images and stories of marvelous occurrences and happy romances. The problem is, these images and fantasies exist only in our minds or on screen. They really aren't enough. We crave the real thing, not this endless daydreaming and titillation. Your task as a seducer is to bring some flesh and blood into someone's fantasy life by embodying a fantasy figure or creating a scenario resembling that person's dreams. No one can resist the pull of a secret desire that has come to life before their eyes. You must first choose targets who have some repression or dream unrealized, always the most likely victims of a seduction. Slowly and gradually, you will build up the illusion that they are getting to see and feel and live those dreams of theirs. Once they have this sensation, they will lose contact with reality and begin to see your fantasy as more real than anything else. Most people have a misconception about illusion. As any magician knows, it need not be built out of anything grand or theatrical. The grand and theatrical can, in fact, be destructive, calling too much attention to you and your schemes. Instead, create the appearance of normality. Once your targets feel secure, nothing is out of the ordinary. You have room to deceive them. In animating a fantasy, the great mistake is imagining that it must be larger than life. That would border on camp, which is entertaining but rarely seductive. Instead, what you aim for is what Freud called the uncanny. Something strange and familiar at the same time, like a déjà vu or a childhood memory, anything slightly irrational and dreamlike. The uncanny, the mix of the real and the unreal, has immense power over our imaginations. The fantasies you bring to life for your targets should not be bizarre or exceptional. They should be rooted in reality, with a hint of the strange, the theatrical, the occult, in Talk of Destiny, for example. You vaguely remind people of something in their childhood or a character in a film or book. The secret to creating an uncanny effect is to keep it subtle. Role-playing is immensely pleasurable. Its appeal goes back to childhood, where we first learn the thrill of trying on different parts, imitating adults or figures out of fiction. As we get older and society fixes a role on us, a part of us yearns for the playful approach we once had, the masks we were able to wear. We still want to play that game, to act a different role in life. Indulge your targets in this wish by first making it clear that you are playing a role, then inviting them to join you in a shared fantasy. The more you set things up like a play or a piece of fiction, the better. Everyone has lost something in life, has felt the pangs of disappointment. The idea that we can get something back, that a mistake can be righted, is immensely seductive. The mind is infinitely vulnerable to suggestion, and even more so when strong desires are involved. And nothing is stronger than the desire to change the past, right or wrong, satisfy a disappointment. Find these desires in your victim, and creating a believable fantasy will be simple for you. Few have the power to see through an illusion they desperately want to believe in. 15. Isolate the victim. An isolated person is weak. By slowly isolating your victims, you make them more vulnerable to your influence. Their isolation may be psychological. By filling their field of vision through the pleasurable attention you pay them, you crowd out everything else in their mind. They see and think only of you. The isolation may also be physical. You take them away from their normal milieu, friends, family, home. Give them the sense of being marginalized, in limbo. They are leaving one world behind and entering another. Once isolated like this, they have no outside support, and in their confusion, they are easily led astray. Lure the seduced into your lair, where nothing is familiar. The people around you may seem strong and more or less in control of their lives, but that is merely a facade. Underneath, people are more brittle than they let on. What lets them seem strong is a series of nests and safety nets they envelop themselves in. Their friends, their families, their daily routines, which give them a feeling of continuity, safety, and control. Suddenly, pull the rug out from under them. Drop them alone into some foreign place where the familiar signposts are gone or scrambled, and you will see a very different person. A target who is strong and settled is hard to seduce. But even the strongest people can be made vulnerable if you can isolate them from their nests and safety nets. Block out their friends and family with your constant presence. Alienate them from the world they are used to and take them to places they do not know. Get them to spend time in your environment. Deliberately disturb their habits. Get them to do things they have never done. They will grow emotional, making it easier to lead them astray. Disguise all this in the form of a pleasurable experience, and your targets will wake up one day distanced from everything that normally comforts them. Then, they will turn to you for help, like a child crying out for its mother when the lights are turned out. In seduction, As in warfare, the isolated target is weak and vulnerable. Your worst enemies in a seduction are often your target's family and friends. They are outside your circle and immune to your charms. They may provide a voice of reason to the seduced. You must work silently and subtly to alienate the target from them. Insinuate that they are jealous of your target's good fortune in finding you, or that they are parental figures who have lost a taste for adventure. The latter argument is extremely effective with young people whose identities are in flux and who are more than ready to rebel against any authority figure, particularly their parents. You represent excitement and life. The friends and parents represent habit and boredom. Murder is not a seductive tactic, but the seducer does enact a kind of killing, a psychological one. Our past attachments are a barrier to the present. Even people we have left behind can continue to have a hold on us. As a seducer, you will be held up to the past, compared to previous suitors, perhaps found inferior. Don't let it get to that point. Crowd out the past with your attentions in the present. If necessary, find ways to disparage their previous lovers, subtly or not so subtly, depending on the situation. Even go so far as to open old wounds, making them feel old pain, and seeing by contrast how much better the present is. The more you can isolate them from their past, the deeper they will sink with you into the present. The principle of isolation can be taken literally by whisking the target off to an exotic locale. Islands cut off from the rest of the world have always been associated with the pursuit of sensual pleasures. The Roman Emperor Tiberius descended into debauchery once he made his home on the island of Capri. The danger of travel is that your targets are intimately exposed to you. It is hard to maintain an air of mystery. But if you take them to a place alluring enough to distract them, you will prevent them from focusing on anything banal in your character. Cleopatra lured Julius Caesar into taking a voyage down the Nile. Moving deeper into Egypt, he was further isolated from Rome, and Cleopatra was all the more seductive. The early 20th century lesbian seductress Natalie Barney had an on-again, off-again affair with the poet Renée Vivien. To regain her affections, she took Renée on a trip to the island of Lesbos, a place Natalie had visited many times. In doing so, she not only isolated Renée, but disarmed and distracted her with the associations of the place, the home of the legendary lesbian poet Sappho. Vivien even began to imagine that Natalie was Sappho herself. Don't take the target just anywhere. Pick the place that will have the most effective associations.